Hey everybody, welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games. Today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my top 10 educational board games. Now these 10 games here are not all necessarily designed with the purpose of teaching or educating, but all 10 of them can be used as tools for instruction, tools to impart knowledge and information on someone else on a given subject. Now, some subjects lend themselves more naturally to these type of games than others. However, there's a few subjects represented on this list. And without any further ado, let's get straight to the list with my number 10 educational board game, and that is Paperback. And Paperback is a deck building game meets Scrabble. The idea is players start with a basic deck of cards of letters, and they're using these letters in order to pay for different cards. You're trying to pay for upgraded letters, and you're trying to pay for fame points, and your fame points are how you win the game. So you start with these basic cards. Some of them are wilds that give you no coins but could represent any letter. Others are consonants, typical consonants like L and S and N and R and T, I believe, are the other starting letters. And throughout the course of the game, players are going to be purchasing more valuable cards that have a variety of different letters. Sometimes you might even have 2 letters depicted on them. And these cards not only grant you a certain amount of coin, which you can use right here, which you can use in order to purchase additional letters or fame cards, as I mentioned, your points, but they also grant you special abilities. However, to trigger the coin and to trigger the special ability, you actually have to use the letter on that turn in the construction of a word. Now, as I mentioned, this game is not innately educational. The players or the teacher of the game is going to have to be a little bit intentional to utilize it for those purposes. But I find that it could be a very helpful exercise into practicing spelling. I find that spelling is a lost art thanks to modern technology and autocorrect and all these different technological advancements that allow people to easily find the correct way of spelling a word. This challenges people to build a word from the ground up and do so correctly. Again, because it's not designed or intended to be educational, but you have to kind of work for it to be. That's why it ranks so low. But it is a fine and fun game. And that's a criteria for all these games. The educational aspect cannot make the fun factor suffer. The fun is still very important in order to qualify for this list. My number 10 educational game, Paperback. And now we move on to my number 9 educational board game, and that is Chicago Express. And this here, published by Queen Games, takes place within the 19th century, and it depicts the expansion, the westward expansion of the United States of America, not to mention the growth, the industrial growth of the railroad industry, the railroad business. And basically, the map here is a zoomed in map of the Midwest. You have cities like Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland and Youngstown and Fort Wayne. You have Lynchburg and Richmond and Clarksburg, and as far east as Philadelphia and New York even. And the players, they're going to be playing down tracks, or actually little rail locomotive or train pieces that represent the idea of tract, of expanding your rails towards the west. And as you make more and more rails, these companies, which are depicted by different colors, are going to become more and more valuable. And throughout the course of the game, players are going to be buying shares in each of the respective companies according to how valuable they think those companies will end up being. And the more expensive or the more valuable these companies become, the more their shares are worth. And when you trigger a payout, or when you get dividends, you're going to get more money based on the value and the amount of shares you have. So I find that this game is educational on multiple fronts if you try to make it be. First of all, the geography is always very helpful. And then that concept, that light stock market simulation that you find in this game, that concept of stocks and shares is a very cool thing to teach young kids, and it's a very fun way of accomplishing that. My number 9 educational board game, Chicago Express. Now we move on to my number 8 educational board game, and that is Ticket to Ride, the entire Ticket to Ride series, because each of these games or each of these expansions consists of a map of a country or a continent, or sometimes even a city. In the base game, you have United States and Southern Canada, but you also have expansions that include maps for Europe, for Africa, for Asia, for countries like India, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Japan. You even have a rails and sails map, which depicts the entire world. And geography, just like spelling, can be a little bit of a lost art. The fact that we have devices like GPS and Google Maps and all these different things that allow for players or for people or for kids to easily locate and find where they are. The sense of direction isn't necessarily that crucial anymore. Now, I will give a caveat that the cities are not 100% accurately depicted because gameplay purposes still takes priority over geographical accuracy. So you might see a city a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, or what have you, but it still gives you a general orientation as to where these cities are located in relationship to the entire country that it's in or all the other nearby cities. I think it's a really cool game that, again, does not have to be educational, but if you try, it can be used in order to teach geography. My number 8 educational board game, Ticket to Ride. And now we move on to my number 7 educational board game. And I actually do not own this game anymore. I used to own this game, but I did give it or sell it away. And that is Through the Ages by Vlad Chvátil. Very highly ranked on BGG, and deservedly so. I must say that I still, to this day, have a great respect for the brilliance of this design. I did sell the game. I got rid of it because it wasn't for me and for the people I game with, in particular because of its length. It's a very lengthy game. Even at a 2-player count, even if you play the abbreviated version of the game instead of the full version, it's still north of 2 hours. So I just had to get rid of it because it wasn't going to get the table time that it deserves. However, I do think it's a brilliant design, and among all the civilization-themed games that I play, I find it to be the most intricate, the most deep from a historical perspective. There's so many things that you can learn from this game. First of all, you have different types of governments. You have dictatorships and totalitarianism, and you have monarchies, you have democracies, republics, all of these different types of governments that are representing the game. And just understanding that concept of all these different types of governments and how they exist and the advantages and disadvantages of each of these governments is something that's interesting to learn from a gameplay perspective. Also, you have all of these different characters in this game, historical personalities all the way back from antiquity. You got guys like Moses and Hammurabi and Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. You have characters, important figures from medieval times, all the way up to modern times, and Albert Einstein even is included in this game. So it's very fun from that perspective. You learn about all of these different characters and which spheres of civilization they influence and impacted, whether it be science or culture or military, and you're factoring all these things in your gameplay decision. So I find that from that perspective, it could be a very educational game that, takes over this huge, the breadth of this game, all the way from antiquity to modern times. It covers many millennia of history. So from that perspective, I find it to be very helpful for educational purposes. My number 7 educational board game, Through the Ages. Now we move on to my number 6. And from this point forward, all of these games are intended or designed in order to be educational, but they're also fun and enjoyable games. My number 6 is Sola Fide, designed by Jason Matthews and Christian Leonard. And these are 2 names you might hear a few more times on this list because these 2 game designers, they actually specialize in this style of game, in educational games, in particular historical games. And this game here, Sola Fide, represents the historical event of the Protestant Reformation back from the early 16th century. And this is a 2-player only game where one player takes on the role of the Roman Catholic Church and the other player takes on the role of the infant Protestant movement. And each player is going to get their own deck. You have the Protestant deck here, or actually I should say the Catholic deck, and the Protestant deck here. And they're not going to use all the cards. They're going to partake in a little bit of deck construction at the beginning of the game. They're only going to get 30 card hand limit or deck limit. And they're going to build their cards according to their particular strategies. And they're going to be using these cards in order to take control of these different regions. And you have all of these regions depicting different provinces in Northern Europe. And basically players are trying to vie for control in each of these provinces. And these little tiles, I'll explain that you have this track up here, which represents your nobility. That's one demographic from the population. And the bottom track here represents the common people, the common folk, the poor people. And basically here on this bar on the side over here, it will determine, based on where it is, the cube is located, it's going to determine which of these two demographics is more important for that particular region. So you're taking actions that help you gain influence in one of these demographics or the other. And you could also play cards that switch over which demographic is more important. So if your opponent is currently winning at the demographic that is currently the priority, and you don't feel like you could take any actions to undo that, perhaps you could take actions that alter which demographic is more important, and all of a sudden you have the upper hand, or perhaps at least you are tied or closer to your opponent, and at least buys you a little bit more time. So it's a little bit of a game of tug of war. You're pulling and pushing and vying for control of all these regions. And once each of the regions on the board is accounted for by the two players, whoever has the most victory points worth of these regions will be the winner of the game. Again, very historically accurate, very historically unbiased, and at the same time, as is customary of many of these Christian Leonard and Jason Matthew games, you either have a section in the back of the rule book or a book all to itself, which explains different cards and all the different historical events and historical personalities depicted on these cards. My number 6 educational board game, Sola Fide. And now we move on to the top 5, the cream of the crop, my 5 absolutely favorite educational board games, starting with my number 5, which is Founding Fathers. And again, this is a co-design by Christian Leonard and Jason Matthews. And in this game, players are taking on the role of founding fathers, planners involved in the process of constructing the Constitution, the United States Constitution. And basically the board here represents the building in which that took place, divided into different rooms. You've got your debate room and your committee room and your assembly room. And there's different articles of the Constitution that are up for contention. And you're going to be using a lot of card play, different cards that represent the delegates, the actual historical people that were involved in this process of drafting and creating the United States Constitution. And basically these different delegates, not only do they represent particular states, so for example here, you've got Oliver Ellsworth, who is a delegate from Connecticut, but they also represent different political factions. So he is in favor of small states policies. You've got Robert Morris here from Pennsylvania. He is a Federalist, and you've got their opposing rivals. Here you have large states who are rivals against the small states, and you've also got the anti-federalists who are rivals to the federalists. And again, these are different parties or factions depicted on these cards, not to mention different states. And every time you vote for a particular article, you have to group together cards from the same state. The delegates must represent the same state. And the more cards you put down, the better, because there's a better chance of your opponents not overturning that decision. Also, whenever you play in favor or against a particular article, each article has a bias towards one faction or the other. So that's something you got to consider. You cannot vote against your own faction, and you cannot vote for the opposing faction of the faction card that you're playing. So those are all things that you've got to consider. And this is basically a multi-purpose card game, because not only can the cards be used in order to vote in the assembly room here in favor or against the different articles up for question, but you can also play those cards to advance on the debate track here. And there's a little bit of a set collection. As you advance on these tracks, you'll collect tokens within the respective factions that at the end of the game will give you victory points according to how valuable those factions are. And finally, you could also use those cards for an event. Each card also has a very special, powerful event that it could trigger, and you could always choose to use it that way. At the end of 4 rounds, the player who most influence in the construction of the Constitution, the player who had the most victory points, is going to be the winner of the game. Really fun game, very simple mechanically speaking, but there is lots of opportunities for strategy. And again, a great game for learning these kind of concepts and learning about all of these different historical figures who actually contributed to this process of the United States Constitution. My number 5 educational board game, Founding Fathers. And now we move on to my number 4 educational board game, and that is 1960, The Making of a President. And this game here, designed by Christian Leonard and Jason Matthews once again, and published by C&C Games. This game here, although it's very zeroed in as far as historical events, it's covering the one particular election in one particular country, the United States of America, that happened in 1960, where you had Richard Nixon representing the Republican Party and John F. Kennedy representing the Democrats. Although it's very zeroed in that way, I still feel that this is a very good educational game because what it teaches people is the idea of the Electoral College and the way that the election process works in the United States of America. Now, while the different electoral states are not distributed exactly the way they are now, over 60 years later, it still gives you an idea of which states have more electoral votes and which ones do not. It gives you an idea of which states are more in favor of one party versus the other and what have you, based on particular icons that you'll find. And I find this game to be so cool because, again, you got card play, multi-purpose cards, where you use these different cards either to gain you campaign points, which will grant you particular actions, namely placing cubes on these different states to represent your support in those locations. But you can also use those campaign points to travel across the country. You cannot just travel freely unless it's within a given region. You could also use those campaign points to earn favor with media. You can use those campaign points to earn favor in particular issues, different issues that are being debated among the different candidates. And if you choose not to use these cards for their campaign points, instead, you can use them for their event. And each card has a very particular event that it triggers. However, some events are very specific to one party or the other, the Republican or Democratic player. So you may not be able to use it as an event. Even if you wanted to, you might be forced to have to use it as campaign points. And it's so cool because this game takes place over the course of 7 rounds, I believe it is. And one round plays radically different than the other 6 because in one round, you're stopping all of this card play in order to gain influence or support in these different states. For one round, all you're going to do is you're going to debate. And the debate is also taking place through the card play, but you're actually acquiring these cards throughout the course of the entire game. Cards that represent different particular issues, the 3 major issues that are covered in this game. And you're using these cards in order to contribute to you successfully winning the debate in each of those 3 categories. And whoever wins the most debates in the debate round is going to be able to place a certain amount of influence on the board right then and there. It is such a cool asymmetric game. Really cool playing one side, either the Republican or the Democrat. But again, it could be very educational, in particular for understanding the Electoral College. My number 4 educational board game, 1960, The Making of a President. And now we move on to my number 3 board game for educational purposes, and that is Freedom, the Underground Railroad. And this here, award-winning game by Academy Games, is a cooperative game that simulates the idea of the Underground Railroad back in the 19th century and the freedom of slaves into Canada. And it is so cool because the board consists of a map. And I just find that games that the boards are a map kind of just lend themselves to the idea of being educational. But here you've got this map, and basically you're using actions to conduct safely, ideally safely, the slaves from their plantations in the south northward to the northern states and ultimately up into Canada. And depending on the player count and the difficulty, you'll have a prerequisite amount of slaves that you're going to have to save. And you're going to have a particular limit of how many you can lose. Throughout the course of the game, you're going to be moving these neutral or NPC characters that represent slave catchers. And they're going to be moving throughout the board, and they're going to be catching the slaves and enslaving them again, which basically is going to cost you each time that happens. And you can only suffer so many of those losses before you win the game. And throughout the course of the game, you're purchasing tokens that allow you to raise funds to buy more tokens. You're purchasing tokens that are going to grant you the actions of moving throughout this board. But you're also going to be purchasing these cards here that are going to grant you special abilities. And each player is going to get a particular character that has a unique ability to him or to her. I find this game to be very fun from a design and gameplay perspective, but it is highly educational. Again, as with most of these games, in the back, you'll find a section that teaches you about lots of the different influential personalities during this time, Civil War times or pre-Civil War times. And it's going to teach you a lot of these different cards, which depict other people and events that transpired. And it's going to explain what those cards, those events, and those characters actually meant historically. This game here treats a very sensitive topic with the sensitivity it deserves, and at the same time, it does not suffer as far as fun is concerned. My number 3 educational board game, Freedom, the Underground Railroad. Now we move on to my number 2 educational board game, and that is Memoir 44, or any of Richard Borg's Command & Colors games. And he has so many out there. I've played Battle Cry, which recreates Civil War. Speaking of Civil War battles between the North and the Confederates. And here you've got the Memoir 44, which recreates lots of World War II battles. In the base game, you've got the German troops and you've got the United States troops. But with some of the expansions, you get the British troops, you get the Russian troops, you get the Japanese. And Memoir 44 depicts World War II, but I've also played Command & Colors Ancients, which takes you back into antiquity, real wars and battles fought between the Romans and the Carthaginians, between the Greeks and the Persians. You've also got Napoleonics, Napoleon's wars against Britain, Napoleon's wars against the Russians. You got all of these different different theaters throughout the course of history in different parts of the world, in different times, different centuries taking place. And what I find so fun about this game is that each scenario is very particular to what actually happened. You get the scenario, which basically tells you where all the troops start. It tells you the terrain features, the topographical features, to give you an idea of what it looked like in that battlefield, whether there were different bodies of water or elevated terrain or walls or whatever it might be. This is all depicted in the scenario book. But the scenario also gives you a little synopsis of what actually happened, the date, the location, who actually won that battle. And each scenario is also going to have winning conditions, special rules, and the starting player, all based on the actual historical events. So, for example, one player might start with more cards than the other player based on the fact that that side of the battle had an advantage over the other side. I find that to be really fun. It's not necessarily meant to be a simulation, so don't take it for that, because again, it's all about the fun and the gameplay, which does not suffer at the expense of the educational element. But it can very much be used in order to teach people history. My number 2 educational board game, Memoir 44. And now we move on to my number 1, my favorite educational board game, the highest ranked educational board game on BoardGameGeek.com, and that is Twilight Struggle. And this here, again, designed by Christian Leonard, or Jason Matthews and Ananda Gupta, actually a different pair, but it is Jason Matthews, who you've heard his name mentioned a few times. And this here basically recreates the Cold War. And the board is a map of the entire world. As I said, boards with maps lend themselves to educational purposes just for that. But each of these On the map, you have each of these different influential countries depicted. And throughout the course of the game, players are going to be placing cubes there to depict, or actually not cubes, they're going to place tokens with numbers on them to depict how much influence they have there. And one player is taking on the role of the USSR, the Soviet Union, and another player is taking on the role of the other superpower, the United States of America. And basically, they're vying for influence in all of these different nations, some more important than others. And they're trying to vie for control in entire continents if they can. And just like 1960 and Sola Fide, other Jason Matthew games, this is a card-based game where the cards are going to determine all the different actions you can take. And you can use the cards for their events, as in the previously mentioned games, or you can use them for action points that let you trigger different actions. And the cool thing about this game is that this game, while it has some very deterministic ways of determining whether you gain influence, they have other ways that are a little bit more press your luck, where you will roll dice, and depending on your roll and your opponent's roll, that will determine who actually places influence and how much influence they place in the country that's in question right then and there. So I find that to be really cool when there's an element of dice rolling for resolution, but at the same way with a little bit of a sense of control and mitigating that. I find that to be very fun. Again, lots of text on these cards, different actual historical events that transpired in history that players can use to learn, to glean lessons from all the things that happened and transpired over this long period of time, covering all the way from 1945 to 1989. Really cool. My number one educational board game, Twilight Struggle. And that's it for today's list, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here with Harriman Board Games. Please comment down below and tell me what's your favorite educational board game. I'm interested in reading what you guys have to say. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.